So we're looking at several reasons to believe that Jesus is God, but we're focusing on the main argument. So this is the main argument that we're focusing on for the entire year. And it's the argument based around miracles, Jesus' miracles. So it goes like this. Premise 1. If someone claims to be God, then we would have good reason to believe them if they could do signs, wonders, and miracles. Okay? Call that the miracle test. Premise 2, there is good historical evidence that Jesus claimed to be God and did signs, wonders, and miracles. And of course, that's where we're going to spend most of our time, is looking and evaluating that historical evidence for his miracles. And if that's the case, then the conclusion would follow. We would have then good reason to believe that Jesus is God. Since we're focusing on premise 2, we want to ask the question, how do we know if a miracle has really happened? Because there's a lot of fakes out there, right? If not fakes, then just honest mistakes. Maybe somebody thought they saw a miracle, but they really didn't. And there are a lot of fakes, people who claim that they can do miracles or have seen a miracle, but they know that they're lying. So how do we know when a real miracle has actually happened? Well, I would say it's the same way that we know that anything in the past has happened. We have to look at the evidence. So if a friend comes to you, let's say, and they claim to have gotten a hole-in-one on the golf course yesterday, you could ask maybe for some evidence of that. Were there any video cameras there on the golf course that captured this hole-in-one? Were there any people with you, any eyewitnesses who saw you get this hole-in-one? You would want some evidence. And so that's what we're doing. We're evaluating the evidence for Jesus' miracles. And that's what I would say separates Christianity from any other belief system, religion, miracle claims. Just the quality and the quantity of the evidence we have for Jesus' miracles is pretty impressive. Okay? And a lot of non-Christians would agree. We've seen this quote a few times now from Antony Flew, one of the most well-known atheist thinkers from the 20th century. And he said that the evidence for Jesus' resurrection is better than for claimed miracles in any other religion. It's outstandingly different in quality and quantity. So last week we began looking at just general evidence for Jesus from an agnostic scholar, an agnostic historian. Some of you might be familiar with Bart Ehrman. He's pretty well known as a New Testament historian, New Testament scholar, but he's an agnostic. And so we're looking at his book in particular because he lays out, in one of his books, he lays out all of the, what you could call just general evidence for the historical Jesus. Things that all scholars would agree on, both Christian and non-Christian scholars. So you might ask, well, why would we look at what an agnostic scholar has to say? We could, use Christian scholars to go through these basic pieces of historical evidence for Jesus, but I find it's a bit strategic to use somebody like Ehrman since he isn't a Christian. Because there are some skeptics, not all skeptics, but some skeptics are not going to be as willing to listen to the evidence or accept the evidence coming from Christian scholars. So it becomes important, I think, to be able to see from this agnostic the evidence that he provides, the historical evidence for Jesus. So this book he wrote, Did Jesus Exist? He wrote this book in particular to respond to who he calls Jesus mythicists. So there are some people out there, more on the popular level, who claim that there never even was a historical Jesus. Not only do they not believe that Jesus was God, neither does Ehrman, he's an atheist, but these Jesus mythicists don't even think that there was a historical human being named Jesus who lived in the first century, Jesus of Nazareth. And so Ehrman wrote this book, 300-400 pages, Did Jesus Exist? And in this book, he lays out all of the evidence for the historical Jesus. So that's what we're starting with in this study, just the general evidence for the historical Jesus that all scholars affirm, including this agnostic scholar, Bart Ehrman. Now, there's weaknesses of this strategy as well, right? I mean, obviously, one of the primary weaknesses of this strategy is that Ehrman himself doesn't believe that Jesus is God. And so we can't use, his argumentation, we can't use his evidence to make the case for Jesus' miracles and Jesus is God, because he doesn't believe those things, right? But what we're merely looking at in this book are the things that I guess we would say we agree with Ehrman about, okay? So we're covering in his book, this particular book, all the things that all scholars affirm, both Christian and non-Christian scholars affirm about the historical Jesus. And you might be surprised. You might be surprised how much common ground there is between Christian and non-Christian scholars on the historical Jesus. So we're going to kind of lay that foundation. You might think of it as we're kind of laying this foundation on the general historical evidence. And then, of course, we're going to have to utilize Christian scholars to make a case for Jesus' actual miracles, to look at that evidence. Okay, last week, just a little bit of review. Last week, we saw Ehrman explain what makes historians more certain that an event actually happened. Remember that list we put together of all the different, I guess it'd be like a wish list. Earlier tonight, some of the girls were sharing their wish list of potential spouses, right? So ingredients that would go into a man cake is how they phrased it. And so similarly, historians, have not a man cake, but a wish list of sources that they would have in order to be able to affirm that something happened in history, right? So the wish list about historical sources. So we ran through this list, and I found this paragraph in his book, a good summary of it, towards the end of his book. So I'll read it just real quickly for us, because it summarizes all that we covered last week. This is what historians want to have, right? So he wrote, as I've stressed throughout this book, doing history, at least ancient history, means abandoning any type of absolute certainty. But even though we can rarely be completely certain about a past event, some things are far more certain than others. Earlier I mentioned the historian's wish list. There you go. When it comes to sources of information about the past. This wish list certainly applies to the historical Jesus. To establish the historical probability of a saying, deed, or experience of Jesus, we want a large number of independent sources that can be shown not to be incorporating their own biases in the account in question, and that corroborate with one another's reports without showing any evidence of collaboration. And the closer these sources are in time to the events they narrate, the better, of course. As I explained last week, I don't prefer the term probability in this conversation. I tend to think of probability more about future events. Like if I'm going to roll a dice, what's the probability I'm going to get a 6 or something like that. I tend to use the word certainty, or how certain can we be about whether an event happened in the past or not. And Ehrman also uses that term, and I prefer to use that one as well. Just how certain can we be? So the more of these things that we have, the more certain we can be of something. And the less of these things, maybe we only have one source instead of multiple sources. It doesn't mean we reject that happened, but we're just not as confident. We're not as certain about it. So degrees of certainty, I think, is a better term to use in this conversation. One example we looked at last week was whether or not Jesus had brothers and whether or not Jesus had sisters. Historians are much more confident that Jesus had brothers because we have more sources that say that, more ancient sources from the 1st century that say that. We only have one source that said he had sisters. So that doesn't mean he didn't have sisters, it just means we're less certain about it because we only have one ancient source that says that, okay? And that's how historians think, that's how historians work in their field. All right, well, based on these criteria then, based on these sources and these type of sources, what can we say about the historical Jesus? In other words, if we were going to make a list, Ehrman, these other New Testament scholars, are going to make a list of all the things that we have like the highest certainty about what would make the list. And we talked about this last week. Ehrman actually put this list together towards the end of his book, page 269, 270. But in his longer paragraph, I just pulled out from his paragraph and listed them out numerically. So these things would be like what historians have the most certainty about concerning the historical Jesus. That he was a Jewish man from Nazareth, that he lived as an adult in the AD 20s. He became a follower of John the Baptist. Then after that became a teacher in rural Galilee. He preached about the kingdom of God, often through parables. He developed a reputation for being able to heal the sick and cast out demons. So even non-Christian scholars would agree that he had that reputation. Now, they might not believe he actually did those things, but they admit that he had that reputation during his lifetime. In around AD 30, early 30s, AD 30, somewhere in that time frame, he went to Jerusalem for the Passover feast, in which he roused opposition among the Jewish leaders, and then the Jewish leaders arranged to have him put on trial before Pontius Pilate. And then Pontius Pilate ordered him to be crucified for calling himself the King of the Jews. So this is something, as I noted here, and actually as Ehrman notes, that all Christian and non-Christian scholars agree on these basic 10 facts. And when you say that phrase, when Ehrman says that phrase, we say that phrase from time to time, all scholars agree on X, Y, Z. What that implies is there must be strong evidence. If all scholars, who dedicate their lives to studying these things agree, then that implies that there must be strong evidence, or else they wouldn't all agree on it, right? Because we don't want to believe something just because the experts say it's so. We want to look at the evidence itself. But when all the experts come to the same conclusion, that implies there must be good evidence. However, I think it's still healthy and good for us to go beyond just the expert's opinion and look at the evidence itself that has led experts to their conclusions, right? And we can do that. We don't have to rely on experts. They're very helpful, and I think we can benefit from them. But if we ourselves want to look at the evidence, we certainly can, and I think should in many cases. And that's what we're doing. That's what we're doing in the course of this study, first with Ehrman's book, just on basic historical facts about Jesus in general, and then more in particular, his miracles, more in the spring semester. So tonight, we're going to see how Ehrman, in this book, lays out the evidence that's found in these historical sources, okay? So we're going to walk through, and Ehrman's going to describe for us actually 22 different historical sources we have about Jesus. And a lot of them pass these criteria, and that's why historians utilize them as information, good, solid, reliable information about the historical Jesus. So we're going to walk through these 22 sources and what they are and what information is contained in these sources. And this is the hardcore evidence which have led scholars to these conclusions, to be very certain about these conclusions. Let's start, though, with this quote from Ehrman, where he explains that he restricts himself to utilize only sources within 100 years of when Jesus died. So I'll read this for us real quick. Ehrman wrote, "I'll restrict myself to sources that were produced within about 100 years of when Jesus is traditionally thought to have died, since writings after that time almost certainly can't be considered independent and reliable witnesses to his life, but were undoubtedly based simply on what the authors had heard about Jesus, probably from his followers." So one thing that we like to do, if you're new at Ratio Christi, is have the speaker take a break and let you guys discuss at your table something that has to do with the subject matter. So I'm going to give you guys a discussion question, then I'll give you a few minutes to chat about it at your respective table. And here's what I want you to chat about. What do you think about this general rule of thumb? limiting himself to only sources within 100 years after Jesus died. So do you think that is too long, too short? Why? So go ahead and discuss at your tables for a few minutes here. Okay. So Ehrman, at least, and I think this is fairly common among New Testament historians, scholars that look at this sort of history. I think limiting yourself to sources within 100 years, I think, is appropriate. I think it's fairly common, even for Christian and non-Christian scholars. So what Ehrman did then throughout his book is he went through what, as he listed it out, 22 sources then that meet that criteria. As he calls them, independent historical sources for Jesus that we can date within 100 years. So if Jesus died sometime in the early 30s, we're talking all the way up to what, around 130 AD, right, is the time limit that Ehrman has set. And within that 100-year period, we have these 22 independent sources. And then a lot of his book, and a lot of what we'll be doing, is just going through and looking at these different sources and seeing what they are, what they have to say, and then it's from these sources that mostly scholars have come to those firm, certain conclusions about those specific historical details that all scholars would affirm about the historical Jesus. So as you can see, there's Roman sources up here, one Jewish source, Christian sources besides the New Testament, and there's several of those we'll take a look at. And then all of these sources are from the New Testament in some way, shape, or form. But Ehrman goes through all these as well and says how they can be useful as sources of historical information about Jesus. Tonight what we're going to do is we're going to cover everything in the left column. So we've got a lot to cover, and I fear, and this is one of the reasons why I tend to focus more on arguments than the facts themselves. As a philosopher especially, I like to lay out an argument and show where the facts are important and pertinent and where they play a role in making a case or in making an argument. But then looking at the actual evidence itself can be a little bit cumbersome, as you'll probably feel by the end of the night, because we'll just be going through a lot of names and dates. And this isn't stuff that hardly anybody, unless you work in this field, memorizes, but it's good to be aware of it and have these sort of sources, like Ehrman's book, that you can refer to when you need to refresh your memory about some of these things. So bear with me as we look at a lot of details, names, and I'll try to make it interesting. Ehrman does a really good job of making all of this historical information interesting as he wrote his book. Okay, so let's run down all the sources on the left-hand column tonight. So the first one, Pliny the Younger. Pliny was a governor of a Roman province in Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey. And we have some documentation that Pliny wrote. In particular, we have some letters that he wrote to the Roman emperor. I'm not sure how it's pronounced, Trajan, Trajan. He wrote letters to the emperor asking for advice on how to govern his province. And in particular, we have a letter that he wrote in AD 112 where he mentions Jesus. So imagine this, we've got Pliny, a governor, and he's writing to the emperor, getting advice on how to govern, and in that letter he mentions Jesus. Now in this particular letter, he's talking about how he should administer a particular law that was passed in the empire about people gathering together. Because in the Roman Empire, they passed a law about people gathering in groups to try to prevent any sort of people gathering together to fight against the empire, right? So they just passed a general law, people can't gather in groups just to try to thwart any sort of uprising, right? But this was leading to all sorts of problems because people couldn't gather in groups for anything. Even, for instance, in this letter, he talks about when even there's a fire in a city, people can't gather together to put out the fire because that would be technically against this law. And so he's asking the emperor for advice on how to administer this particular law. And in the context of that, he talks about Christians, because they're also trying to gather together as a group, as you can imagine, as Christians often do. So here's what Ehrman wrote about this letter then we have from Pliny the Younger. Take a look at this. Ehrman wrote, Pliny learned from reliable sources that the Christians illegally, against this law, gathered together in the early morning. Pliny provides us with some important information about the group. They included people from a variety of socioeconomic levels. They ate meals together of common food. Pliny may tell the emperor this because of rumors, which we hear from other later sources, that Christians committed cannibalism, right? Or that's at least what the Romans thought, because after all, they were eating the flesh of the Son of God and drinking his blood. Moreover, Pliny informs the emperor these Christians, quote, sing hymns to Christ as to a god. This reference does tell us that there were Christians worshiping someone named Christ in the early 2nd century in the region of Asia Minor. Whatever Pliny knows about Christ, he appears to have learned from the Christians who informed them, and so he doesn't provide us with completely independent testimony that Jesus actually existed, only the testimony of Christians living some 80 years after Jesus would have died. So you're going to see, as Ehrman points out with all these 22 different resources, that none of them pass all of the criteria, right? We don't have the perfect wish list of sources. So he's going to point out which of these different sources pass the different criteria. And in this one, it might not be completely independent, as he says, because he probably got the information from the Christians there in the early 2nd century. Okay? Let's move on to Suetonius. Okay? Suetonius was a Roman biographer, and he wrote 12 biographies of different Roman emperors. One particular work of his was called Lives of the Caesar, which he wrote in AD 115, so early 2nd century. Now, in the particular biography that he wrote of Claudius, the Emperor Claudius, who reigned as emperor from 41 to 54 AD, he indicates that Claudius, the emperor at that time, deported all the Jews, kicked all the Jews out of Rome because of riots that were occurring at the, what he says, Suetonius, at the instigation of Chrestus. And historians are convinced that this Chrestus is a misspelled Latin form of what we would say in English, Christ. Now the Latin form technically is Christus, Christus, and it seems like Suetonius misspelled that with an E instead of an I. But most scholars agree that he was talking about Jesus Christ in particular. So look what Ehrman wrote about this source. A large number of scholars over the years have thought that the situation in Rome is relevant for understanding early Christian history. In this theory, according to these scholars, it was Roman Jews who believed that Jesus was the Messiah, or Christ, Christus, misspelled Latin form, who had stirred up the passions of Jews who did not believe. This led to violent reactions that got out of hand, the riots that Suetonius mentioned, and so Claudius, the emperor, kicked them out. He expelled the whole lot of them. And this is actually confirmed by Luke in the book of Acts in the New Testament. He talks about this situation where the Jews were kicked out of Rome. So that's our second source for tonight, Suetonius. Let's move on. Some of these we're going to go through pretty quickly. The third one is Tacitus. Okay? Now Tacitus was a Roman senator and a historian. He lived from 56 to 117 AD. And he wrote a work called The Annals of Imperial Rome in AD 115. And this was a history of the Roman Empire from 14 to 68 AD. And in this history, he's talking about first century history of the empire. He talks about a large fire that burned a lot of Rome during the reign of Nero in AD 64. Okay? So he's giving an entire history of the empire over a large portion of the first century, and he talks about this fire in Rome that burned down a lot of the city. Tacitus explains that Nero, the emperor himself, had arsonists start the fire because he had some architectural ideas. He wanted to change the city and build some different architectural plans that he had for the city. But to do that, he had to get rid of the buildings that were already there. And so he had these arsonists start these fires that got out of control. As you can imagine, there was a lot of backlash, right? A lot of anger at the emperor, at Nero, for causing these fires. And so he looked for a scapegoat. He looked for somebody to blame it on. And of course, he picked the Christians. This was, according to Tacitus, happened in 64 AD. Now, many people were willing to believe that the Christians had started the fires because they had, a lot of people had started to hate the Christians because, quote, their hatred of the human race. So it almost kind of reminds me a little bit of like, Nazism, right, in the 20th century, where they had this view, at least the Nazis did, that the Jews were somehow conniving against the entire human race, and they hated all other ethnicities. The Jews did, and that's why there was so much hatred, that propaganda against the Jews that the Nazis created. And so it sounds like similarly this was going on against the Christians in the first century in the Roman population. So Nero, quite famously then, had Christians arrested for these fires that they didn't even do and executed in horrific, terrible ways. And this is all according to Tacitus, this Roman senator and historian. So Ehrman explains, this is Ehrman now, Tacitus wrote that Nero falsely accused those whom the populace called Christians. The author of this name, Christ, was put to death by the procurator Pontius Pilate while Tiberius was emperor. But the dangerous superstition, though suppressed for the moment, broke out again not only in Judea, the origin of this evil, but even in the city of Rome. So here we have Tacitus as a Roman historian and senator, and he says that Christ, which these Christians follow, was crucified under Pontius Pilate, or put to death under Pontius Pilate. So this gives historians a lot of certainty then that he really was put to death by Pontius Pilate. All right, let's look at a famous Jewish source now, Josephus. Now, a little bit about Josephus. He was born in the AD 30s, okay? And he was a Jewish general who was part of the army, the Jewish army that rose up against the empire and tried to uprise and defeat and fight for their independence in AD 66. So you think about that. He was a Jewish general, right, fighting against Roman soldiers. Well, he and his soldiers were defeated in battle, and he surrendered to the Roman authorities, okay? So he became an interpreter. When he surrendered, eventually he became an interpreter for the Emperor Vespasian, okay? And as an interpreter, he also wrote a lot of records, okay? So in AD, for instance, AD 93, he finished a 20-volume work called The Antiquities of the Jews. And this was, according to Josephus, a history of his own people, a history of the Jewish people from the time of Adam and Eve, all the way up to his time, all the way up to what we would call the first century now. And really, Josephus is just a wealth of information for us historically about the life and culture of Palestine, what we would say Israel, in the first century. So Josephus is really, for historians, he's the primary source to know about what life was like in first century Palestine. Very important historical source. Josephus talks about John the Baptist, he talks about Jesus, he talks about Jesus' brother James. So we have a lot of information from Josephus about early Christianity. In particular, Josephus describes James as the brother of Jesus who is called the Messiah, okay? And talks about how James, this brother of Jesus, was unlawfully put to death in AD 62. So we've got some historical information about Jesus' brother James from Josephus. In another place, we have a lengthier description of Jesus from Josephus. So take a look at this quote. This is from Josephus. At this time there appeared Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one should call him a wise man. For he was a doer of startling deeds, a teacher of people who received the truth with pleasure. And he gained a following both among many Jews and among many of Greek origin. He was the Messiah. And when Pilate, because of an accusation made by the leading men among us, condemned him to the cross, those who had loved him previously did not cease to do so. For he appeared to them on the third day, living again, just as the divine prophets had spoken of these and countless other wondrous things about him. And up until this very day, the tribe of Christians, named after him, has not died out. So again, this is written by Josephus in AD 93. However, you might very well know that there's a problem with this information. You see, the problem is Josephus's works were kept alive only by Christians. So Christian copyists are the ones who made copies of Josephus' work. The Jews refused to copy and keep Josephus' work alive because they viewed him, as you can imagine, as a traitor. Like he joined, the Roman Empire as the interpreter for the emperor. So they viewed him as a traitor and didn't copy his works. It was the Christian scribes who copied Josephus. So virtually all scholars agree that these Christian scribes inserted some information in Josephus's account, okay? So some of this actually wasn't written by Josephus. Some of it was added by Christian scribes as they were copying all of Josephus's work. So I'll let Ehrman explain what's going on here. So as Ehrman explains, the big question here is whether a Christian scribe or scribes simply added a few choice Christian additions to this passage, or whether the entire thing was produced by a Christian and then inserted into an appropriate place in Josephus's Antiquities. The reason why scholars think this, by the way, is that Josephus, being a Jew, probably wouldn't say as wonderful things about Jesus, like his miracles and rising on the third day. It would be unlikely that a Jewish person would say those things. Otherwise, they would have become Christian if they believed those things. So that's why scholars think that Christian scribes added at least some of that stuff. Ehrman goes on, the majority of scholars of early Judaism and experts on Josephus think that it was the former, that one or more Christian scribes touched up the passage a bit. So if one takes out the obviously Christian comments, the passage may have been rather innocuous, reading something a little bit more like this. So Ehrman then provides the same quote as before, This is in Ehrman's book, quote from Josephus, but then he takes out what was probably added by a Christian scribe, and that's what I've crossed out here, and then you're left with the remainder. And this is what scholars would say, most scholars would say, this is probably what was in, I used the word that I said I don't use, didn't I? scholars are more certain that this goes back to what Josephus wrote. So you can see what's been removed is the stuff, he was the Messiah. He rose on the third day, so on and so forth. And so back to Ehrman again. Ehrman concludes from this, it's far more likely that the core of the passage actually does go back to Josephus himself. And when he's talking about the core, he's talking about things in white here. Most scholars continue to be convinced that Josephus did indeed write about Jesus, probably in something like the pared down version that I quote above. And this is what Ehrman's talking about. I took this right from Ehrman's book. Okay, I know we're going through this pretty quick, but a lot of it's just historical information, good things to be aware of, understand how scholars dig through all this stuff. I'm thankful for people like Ehrman and others who weed through this and dedicate their lives to trying to understand the historical evidence. But now I want to give you guys another discussion question, because we're going to move on now to the Christian sources that Ehrman covers in his book. Christian sources besides the New Testament. So we're going to run through the rest of these tonight and we'll be done. But I want you to discuss at your table here for a few minutes the following question. What concerns do you think historians might have about Christian sources for getting information about the historical Jesus? What might they be concerned about looking at Christian sources in particular? I overheard a lot of you say this, and this was the first thing that came to my mind as well, is concerns about bias, right? And that historians are always concerned about that. And biases work both ways, right? So the non-Christian sources might be biased against Jesus because they're not Christians, of course. That's a possibility. But then you also have to take into consideration then that the Christian sources might be a bit biased towards Jesus. Another thing that historians have to keep in mind also when it comes to Christian sources in particular is whether they're independent or not. Okay, so think about that for a moment. How do we know that these different sources, or why should we consider them independent sources? How do we know that one didn't get their information from the other? Because as we talked about, that would not make it independent. If Mike saw a car accident and then he told Sarah about it, we wouldn't have two independent sources. We would only have one, Mike. Now, if Sarah saw herself too, then we would have two sources. So you see the difference? So that is something that historians have to keep in mind when they're looking at these Christian sources. How do we know they just didn't get the information from one another or one source that got spread around to different people? And you'll see Ehrman talk about that and why he's come, at least he and most all other scholars have come to the conclusion that no, these are independent sources from one another. But he'll discuss that quite a bit. So here's how he kind of starts off this section of the book. He says, there's also important independent sources among Christian writers from about the same time as Tacitus, writers who convey information about the historical Jesus and certainly attest to his existence, and we'll see even more than that. They do so without deriving all or even most of their information from the gospel sources, because that is one of the concerns, is if we're just getting this maybe from later Christians, maybe they just got that from the Gospels. So then that wouldn't be an independent source. Why consider these independent sources independent from the New Testament Gospels? But he'll explain why historians have come to that conclusion as we run through them. So let's do just like we did with the others. We'll start with Papias. All right. Now Papias was an early Christian leader. He wrote a 5-volume work called The Expositions of the Sayings of the Lord. Okay, so Expositions of the Sayings of Jesus. And he wrote this 5-volume work in the 120s AD. So between 120 and 130 AD. Now, unfortunately, most of his work has been lost. The 5-volume work that he wrote has been lost in history, but we still have access to some of it in the form of quotes that other people quoted his 5-volume work. And so we have quotes of his work in other people's writings that have been preserved in that way. So here's a quote we have from Papias then, from the 120s, so early 2nd century. He wrote, "I also will not hesitate to draw up for you, along with these expositions, an orderly account of all the things I've carefully learned and have carefully recalled from the elders." These would be like who we would call apostles, right? Jesus' 12 disciples. "For I have certified their truth. Whenever someone arrived who had been a companion of one of the elders, I would carefully inquire after their words, what Andrew or Peter had said, or what Philip or what Thomas had said, or James or John or Matthew, or any of the other disciples of the Lord, and what things Aristion and the elder John, disciples of the Lord, were saying. For I did not suppose that what came out of books would benefit me as much as that which came from a living and abiding voice." Here's another part of Papias' writing. He wrote, "And this is what the elder John used to say. When Mark was the interpreter or translator of Peter, he wrote down accurately everything that he recalled of the Lord's words and deeds, but not in order, not in chronological order. For he neither had heard the Lord nor had accompanied him. But later, as I indicated, he accompanied Peter, who used to adapt his teaching for the needs at hand, not arranging, as it were, an orderly composition of the Lord's sayings. And so Mark did nothing wrong by writing some of the matters as he remembered them, for he was intent on just one purpose, to leave out nothing that he had heard or to include any falsehood among them." And then lastly, one more quote from Papias that Ehrman includes in his book. There's a short one down there. "And so Matthew composed the sayings in the Hebrew tongue, and each one interpreted or translated them to the best of his ability." Now, some scholars think that Papias here is talking about what we refer to as the Gospels of Mark and Matthew, when he's describing who wrote them and how they went about writing them, the Gospels of Mark and Matthew in the New Testament. But other scholars, including Ehrman, think he's talking about other works or other Gospels. Okay, but regardless, without even diving into that controversy, look at what Ehrman says about Papias here as a historical source. So Ehrman wrote, "Papias is an important source of establishing the historical existence of Jesus. He was personally acquainted with people who had known either the apostles themselves or their companions. He's quite specific, and there's no reason to think he's telling a bald-faced lie, that he knows people who knew the apostles or the apostles' companions. This is not eyewitness testimony to the life of Jesus, but it's getting very close to that. This then is testimony that is independent of the Gospels themselves, and it is yet one more independent line of testimony among the many we have seen so far. And this time it's a testimony that explicitly and credibly traces its own lineage directly back to the disciples of Jesus themselves. So I think this is pretty impressive. And Ehrman seems to think so as well. Okay, let's move on to Ignatius. Okay, Ignatius was a leader of a large, important church in Antioch of Syria. Okay, he was arrested around AD 110. Okay, so he was arrested as part of this general persecution of Christians, and then he was horrendously executed in the arena by being thrown to wild beasts. On his way, traveling to his own execution, he wrote 7 letters, which we still have today. Okay, so here is a quote from one of these letters that Ignatius wrote in AD 110 as he was on his way to his execution. He wrote, "For you're fully convinced about our Lord, that he was truly from the family of David according to the flesh, Son of God according to the will and power of God, truly born from a virgin, baptized by John, that all righteousness might be fulfilled by him. In the time of Pontius Pilate and the Tetrarch Herod, he was truly nailed for us in the flesh. We ourselves come from the fruit of his divinely blessed suffering, so that through his resurrection he might eternally lift up the standard for his holy and faithful ones, whether among Jews or Gentiles, in the one body of his church. For he suffered all these things for our sake, that we might be saved. And he truly suffered, just as he also truly raised himself. Not as some unbelievers say, that he suffered only in appearance. They are the ones who are only in appearance. And it will happen, have to dig right there. And it will happen to them just as they think, since they are without bodies, like the demons, I suppose. For I know and believe that he was in the flesh even after the resurrection. So here's what Ehrman has to say about this source, about Ignatius. Okay. So this is from Ehrman. Ehrman wrote, even though there's allusions to traditions that made it into the Gospels, there's no conclusive evidence to suggest that Ignatius is basing his views on the books that later became part of the New Testament. Ignatius then provides us with yet another independent witness to the life of Jesus. Again, it should not be objected that he is writing too late to be of any value in our quest. He cannot be shown to have been relying on the Gospels. And he was bishop in Antioch, the city where both Peter and Paul spent considerable time in the preceding generation, as Paul himself tells us in Galatians 2. His views, too, can trace a lineage straight back to apostolic times. Okay, moving on quickly here, we can go now to 1 Clement. Now, this is a letter that was written during the AD 90s, okay? And it was written by Christians in Rome, possibly even Clement himself, who was the bishop of Rome in the AD 90s. And Ehrman lists all sorts of things that in this letter Clement or the Christians in Rome say about Jesus, including, I'm not going to read all of them, but in this letter they talk about how the blood of Jesus is precious to the Father, poured out for salvation. The blood of the Lord brought redemption. The Lord adorned himself with good works. Out of his love, the Lord Christ Jesus gave his blood for us, his flesh for our flesh, his soul for our souls in this letter. So here quickly is what Ehrman says about this letter. Ehrman wrote, the letter quotes extensively from the Greek Old Testament, and its author explicitly refers to Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. But he does not mention the Gospels of the New Testament, and even though he quotes some of the sayings of Jesus, he does not indicate that they come from written texts. In fact, his quotations do not line up in their wording with any of the sayings of Jesus found in our surviving Gospels. Here again, then, we have an independent witness, not just to the life of Jesus as a historical figure, but to some of his teachings and his deeds. Okay, an interesting one, the Gospel of Thomas, Ehrman includes of his list of 22 historical sources. Now, you might be familiar a little bit with the Gospel of Thomas. It's very brief, at least what we have of it that survived to this day. It's only 114 sayings of Jesus, so 114 verses, if you will. We don't know who the author was, and there are elements of early Gnosticism. We're going to talk more about Gnosticism later tonight, but there's elements of early Gnosticism in this Gospel of Thomas. Scholars agree it wasn't written by the Thomas, right? But that's what it's called, the Gospel of Thomas. Look what Ehrman has to say about this Gospel of Thomas. Ehrman wrote, Gospels continued to be written after John, the Gospel of John, however, and some of these later accounts are also independent. Even though some continue to place the Gospel of Thomas, in the first century, possibly prior to all or some of the canonical Gospels, more widely it is thought that in its current form, Thomas comes to us from the early 2nd century, say 110, 120 CE. I would say AD, same thing. Moreover, while some scholars think that Thomas relied on Matthew, Mark, and Luke for some of its sayings, there are overlaps in about half of them. It's more commonly thought that Thomas is independent, that it got its information from other sources. In either event, a good portion of the Gospel of Thomas, if not all of it, does not derive from the canonical text in the New Testament. To that extent, it is a fifth, and he numbers them, he orders them in a different order, so this isn't fifth for us, but the way that Ehrman lays it out, it was fifth in his list. To that extent, it's a fifth independent witness to the life and teachings of Jesus. I'm going to give you guys another discussion question now. And this question is going to take a little bit of thought, but take a look at this. How can Christians, or is it appropriate for Christians to reject the Gospel of Thomas from being in the Bible, but still use it as a source of historical information about Jesus? Can Christians do that? Is that appropriate? Why or why not? So go ahead and chat at your tables for a little bit. I see from the clock that we're running out of time. We only got about 7 minutes left tonight, so we're going to run through the rest of these pretty quickly. But I would just say it is appropriate, right? I wouldn't see it much different as some of these other historical sources. I mean, certainly we wouldn't agree with everything that some of these other historical sources wrote either. And that's how historians are looking at it. Remember, we have to try to put ourselves in the frame of mind where we're evaluating even the New Testament documents as ancient sources at this stage of making the case for Christianity. So we're not quite to that part, or making the case for Christianity, where we're making the argument that the Bible is from God. We're still in the stage of putting together an overall argument for Christianity, where we're still just evaluating even the New Testament as ancient historical sources. So I think it's good and appropriate, especially when we're in this stage of looking at things, to evaluate the Gospel of Thomas as a potential historical source, even if we might not think everything that's in it is true or correct, or that it's really a message from God. And that's how historians look at all of these sources. They don't, just because they're old doesn't mean they believe everything that is written in them. They try to look at corroboration, and if there's multiple sources saying the same thing, they're not going to believe a source just because it says it, right? So I think it makes sense to look at it, even as a Christian, as a potential historical source. Similar then with the Gospel of Peter. Now, the Gospel of Peter is dated by most people to the sometime written in the 2nd century. Ehrman himself thinks it was written in the early 2nd century. And we only have some fragments of this particular work. It claims to be from Peter, but most scholars, I think virtually all scholars, agree that the real Peter didn't read it, didn't actually write it. We even have records of early church leaders who were familiar with this Gospel of Peter, and they knew that it wasn't really written by Peter. So we have early church leaders who were aware of this, saying, hey, no, don't trust this was really from Peter, because it wasn't. So the early church was aware of this work as well. In this story, in this Gospel of Peter, Pilate isn't the one who sentences Jesus. Herod is the one who sentences Jesus to be crucified. And this goes against all of our other historical sources. So that's one reason why scholars, so an example of scholars still thinking it's a good historical source, but don't believe that everything in it is correct. Okay, even though the author is wrong, it's a lie, it's pseudepigrapha, it's not really from Peter, and it has some historical information that we know from other sources is wrong, it's still considered useful as a source for at least some historical information, the stuff that it corroborates with those other sources. So look at how Ehrman describes it here. Ehrman says, the same can be said of the Gospel of Peter. This is a fragmentary account of Jesus' trial, death, and resurrection. Once again, even though there is some similarity in portions of the account to what's found in the canonical Gospels, it's widely thought that Peter preserves an independent narrative drawn from other non-canonical sources. So I'll give you an example of how it can be useful. So if it is saying some of the same things that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are saying, then it's like a fifth corroboration to those sources, if it's saying the same thing. And when it says something different, we might say, well, that it's mistaken there, but if it says the same thing as other historical sources are saying, then it's, as Ehrman points out, it can be considered another independent source corroborating those particular facts. Remember, that's how historians, as we talked about last week, look at these things. They're not looking at it as source by source, per se, if it's all reliable or not reliable. They're looking at event after event after event, and then how many sources would corroborate that event. So whether Jesus was sentenced to death by Herod or Pontius Pilate, that would be one of those things. There's more sources that say he was sentenced by Pontius Pilate. So that's what has convinced historians that Pilate was the one who sentenced him to death. Okay, the last one then we're going to look at tonight has kind of a weird name to it. Papyrus Egerton, I believe it's pronounced, 2. And we only have some fragments of this left as well. It can be dated, we're not sure, but scholars date it anywhere from the late 1st century to the 2nd century. But I'll let Ehrman just explain a little bit about what this source is all about. He says, another independent account occurs in the highly fragmentary text called Papyrus Egerton 2. Here again, it's difficult to know how extensive the full gospel contained in these partial remains that we have, how big the original was. What survives are 4 episodes from the life of Jesus, one of which has no parallel in the Gospels of the New Testament or in any other known gospel. So here then, at least in the non-paralleled sort, but probably in all 4 of these episodes, is a 7th independent account. And again, Ehrman's going through them in a different order, so for him 7th, ours a different number. I think we're up to, 10 now? So we don't have much new information about Jesus that we don't already know from other sources in this source, but it's just good independent corroboration on some major details. Now, real quickly tonight, I know we're out of time, but I want to cover this. It won't take me very long, but I want to cover 2 other sources that people often claim give us information about the historical Jesus, but Ehrman is going to argue no, in fact, they don't. So the first one is pagan myths. You might hear this sometimes. You might hear, as Ehrman points out, one of the most widely asserted claims found in the mythicist literature, those who don't believe there ever was a historical Jesus, is that Jesus was just an invention of the early Christians who had been deeply influenced by the prevalent notion of a dying, rising God as found throughout the pagan religions of antiquity. The theory behind this claim is that people in many ancient religions worship gods who died and rose again. And then he lists several examples of this that mythicists often give. Ehrman goes on, though, to explain, even though mythicists do not appear to know it, this one-time commonly held view that dying, rising gods were widespread in pagan antiquity has fallen on hard times among scholars. The category of dying and rising gods, once a major topic of scholarly investigation, must be understood to have been largely a misnomer based on imaginative reconstructions in exceedingly late or highly ambiguous texts. And this is a quote that Ehrman is taking from Mark Smith, who's a scholar of the ancient Near East. Moreover, Smith emphasizes a good deal of our information about these other gods comes from sources that date from a period after the rise of Christianity, writers who themselves were influenced by Christian views of Jesus and who often received their information secondhand. The last quote I want to share with you from Ehrman about these dying, rising God suggestions. It says, one major question, as we will see, is whether there even was a common mythology of dying and rising gods. Moreover, it stretches credulity to think that such a mythology, if it did exist, played any role in the world of Jesus' earliest Jewish followers in Palestine. To Paul, he, Jesus, was not a dying, rising God like those discussed among the pagans, if in fact there was such a pagan view at all. So I think this is helpful, coming from, an agnostic, atheist, historian, scholar, to clear up some of these issues. The other one, and this is the last thing we'll cover tonight, just real quickly, is more of these Gnostic writings. Now, Gnosticism was a religion that developed in the 2nd century, and it combined some elements of Christianity and some elements of Platonism. For example, one of the Platonistic ideas within Gnosticism is that everything that was physical was evil. According to Gnosticism, Yahweh in the Old Testament wasn't actually the ultimate being. There was a different supreme being greater than Yahweh. And you can only know this, the real ultimate God, through secret knowledge. That's why it's called Gnosticism. Gnostic means knowledge, so an agnostic says they don't have knowledge of God. Gnosticism is this knowledge, secret knowledge, that you had to have in order to be saved and know this ultimate God. Some Gnostic works include the Gospel of Philip, Gospel of Mary, Gospel of Judas, and we have writings, like I've talked about before, from early church leaders who were familiar with these works and rejected them. They said, no, we're aware of these. They weren't written by Philip, Mary, and Judas. But sometimes you'll hear people, more at the popular level, say that no, we can learn about the historical Jesus from these Gnostic works. But Ehrman argues no, that's not the case. So for instance, these last couple quotes from Ehrman, and we'll be done tonight. Ehrman said, there are, of course, lots of other Gospels, some actually 40 or so, all the way written down through the early Middle Ages that are not found in the New Testament. These include narratives of Jesus as a newborn, as a young child, where he uses his miraculous powers, sometimes for mischief, sometimes for good. Narratives of his public ministry, narratives of his death and resurrection, and almost all of these accounts, of course, are highly legendary. And with the passing of time, they become less and less valuable as independent historical sources. We have nothing to suggest that the beliefs embraced by the later Gnostic Christians were present in first century rural Palestine. And so these Gnostic sayings of Jesus found in such Gnostic Gospels like I said, the Gospel of Philip, Gospel of Mary, almost certainly don't go back to Jesus himself, but were placed on his lips by his later Gnostic followers. So I just wanted to cover those two things really quickly because sometimes you'll hear that these Gnostic writings and then these pagan myths can be sources to learn about the historical Jesus. But Ehrman shoots both of those down and says, no, they're not good sources of information about the historical Jesus. Just a reminder, all that we're doing covering Ehrman's work is laying this foundation. So from Ehrman we can see what all Christian and non-Christian scholars affirm. And then when we're done with that, we're going to move on and make a case for more of these level 2 and level 3, what we would call historical facts about Jesus, that he did miracles, so on and so forth. And for that, of course, we won't be able to use Ehrman because he doesn't believe some of these things. And so we'll have to move on to Christian scholars. And you might say, well, of course they believe these things because they're Christian scholars. They have to believe them. But it might be the case that the reason that they're Christians is because they're impressed by the evidence. And they're going to use the same process that Ehrman and others have used to establish these things, independent sources, corroboration, but they're going to become convinced, or they have become convinced, that the evidence is strong enough for us to conclude Jesus performed miracles. And so that's how we'll make the case for these things eventually in the spring semester. One of the scholars we'll use to do that is Bruce Metzger. And this is somebody who Ehrman actually got his PhD under at Princeton. Metzger is a firmly committed Christian, and he was at Princeton as a professor, an expert in this area for almost 50 years. So that's where we're going in our study. I know it's been kind of a long night and it's been a lot of historical facts, but I think they're important for us to know and be aware of. And you guys did a good job listening, so I appreciate that.